This special edition podcast is a direct response to the messages I received after episode 4 was released about divine masculine and feminine energy and their toxic counterparts. A question went viral not long ago, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further. The question was simple. It asked women, if you were alone in the woods, would you feel safer with a man or a bear? The answer that came back from tens of thousands of women across countries, cultures, and generations stopped a lot of people cold. They chose the bear. Now, before you respond to my bear comment reference, before you get defensive or dismissive or start formulating a counter-argument, I want you to stay in the question for a moment, because the question is not really about bears, and it is not really about men. The question is a mirror. And what it is reflecting back at us is something we, as a society, have been avoiding as a culture for decades, centuries even. Something is out of balance. And the consequences of that imbalance is the fear, the distrust, the harm, the disconnection between men and women, and within men themselves. Those consequences are no longer quiet. They are everywhere. This episode is not about condemning men. I want to be absolutely clear about that from the start. It is about tracing something back to its roots through psychology, neuroscience, history, and through the wisdom traditions that understood something about this balance that our modern world has largely forgotten. And most importantly, it is about finding a path forward, not through blame and not through division, but through the hardest and most necessary thing human beings can do. Integration. Let's begin today's special edition.
We're going beyond horizons, where the mind and spirit meet, where the body finds its balance and the soul feels complete. Every story, every journey, every healing step we take, we're living life with purpose, with every breath we make. Beyond horizons, we rise.
Welcome to Beyond Horizyns. I'm Sugita-Jackson, and today we are doing something a little different. This is a special edition episode because some conversations are too important, too timely, and too consequential to fit neatly into a standard format. And this is one of them. On this show, we explore the intersection of holistic wellness, metaphysical inquiry, spiritual philosophy, ancient wisdom, and honest, grounded, science-informed conversation. And we do it because I believe deeply that the most important conversations of our time require more than outrage and opinion. They require deep understanding. They require history. They require the kind of nuance that social media was not built to hold. Today, we are talking about toxic masculinity. This is not political or an attack, but as a genuine inquiry into what is happening, why it is happening, what the research shows, what the wisdom traditions understood long before we had the vocabulary for it, and what the path toward healing actually looks like. Care it deserves. Before we go deep in today's conversation, I want to take a moment because what we are building with Horizyns is directly connected to the kind of work this episode represents. Horizyns is a platform coming in 2026, an all-in-one marketplace, learning hub, and intentional community built for people in the holistic, spiritual, and wellness space. But more than a platform, it is a commitment to the kind of conversation we need more of. Conversations that honor complexity, that blend ancient wisdom with modern understanding, that build connection across the divides that our current culture keeps widening. If you are a creator, vendor, a practitioner, a healer, a teacher, or someone who is simply trying to live more intentionally in a world that makes that hard, Horizyns is being built for you. You can learn more and schedule a personal demo at www.horizyns.com. That is HORIZYNSINC.com. The link is in the show notes. Come see what we are building. I think you will really enjoy it. Let's start by defining our terms carefully. Because toxic masculinity is one of the most misunderstood and misused phrases in contemporary cultural discourse, and that misunderstanding is itself part of the problem. Toxic masculinity is not masculinity. Period. This distinction is not semantic, it is foundational. The term was not invented by feminists to attack men. It originated in the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s, a movement led by largely men. For men concerned with reclaiming authentic masculine identity from distorted cultural scripts. Scholars, including Shepard Bliss and later Terry Coopers, helped develop the clinical definition. Cooper's writing in the journal Aggression and Violent Behavior in 2005 defined toxic masculinity as the constellation of socially regressive masculine traits that serve to foster domination, devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence, and that led to men's psychological suffering. Toxic masculinity is not about men being strong, protective, decisive, or physically powerful. Those are expressions of healthy masculinity, and they are genuinely valuable. Toxic masculinity is specifically about what happens when those traits become disconnected from emotional intelligence, critical thinking, empathy, accountability, and the capacity for authentic connection. It is not masculinity in excess. It is masculinity in isolation, cut off from its counterbalancing principles. Psychologist Ronald Levant at the University of Akron has spent decades researching what he calls normative male alexithymia, the culturally induced difficulty many men experience in identifying and expressing emotions. His research, published in the Psychology of Men and Masculinity, found that men socialized within traditional masculine norms show measurably reduced emotional vocabulary and emotional processing capacity compared to men socialized in less rigid gender environments. This does not come down to biology. This is a conditioning, and conditioning can be changed. The American Psychological Association's 2018 Guidelines on Psychological Practice with Boys and Men was the first such guidelines in the organization's 127-year history. It drew on more than 40 years of research to conclude that traditional masculine ideology was the cultural script that demands stoicism, self-sufficiency, dominance, and the suppression of vulnerability, and it is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, substance abuse, depression, suicide, and relationship dysfunction. The mask of invulnerability is literally killing men, and in its expression outward, it is causing measurable harm to the people around them. Masculinity, not men. It is the mask men have been handed and told to never take off. Now, let's go into the neuroscience, because understanding what is happening in the brain helps us understand why this is so hard to change and why shame-based approaches to this conversation are not only unhelpful, but psychologically counterproductive. The stress response system known as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, responds to perceived threat by activating a cascade of neurochemical events. Cortisol rises. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperactivated. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for rational judgment, empathy, and impulse regulation, and it becomes functionally impaired. In a state of acute threat, the brain quite literally loses access to its most sophisticated capacities. This is not a character flaw, this is biology. Now consider what happens to a boy who is raised in an environment where emotional expression is consistently punished, where crying is a weakness, where fear must be hidden, where vulnerability is exploited, where the baseline emotional environment is one chronic low-level threat. Research in developmental neuroscience, including landmark work by Bruce Perry at the Child Trauma Academy, has documented how chronic early stress literally reshapes the developing brain. The amygdala becomes sensitized, responding to lower and lower threat thresholds. The prefrontal cortex develops with reduced capacity for emotional regulation. The neurological architecture for empathy and connection is literally shaped by the emotional environment in which a child develops. This means that many of the men we label as toxic are not operating from a place of power. They are operating from a nervous system that never learned safety, from a brain that was wired in its most formative period to survive rather than to connect. This is not an excuse for their behavior. Cause is not the same as justification, but it is an explanation. And without the explanation, there is no path to change, only condemnation, which the research consistently shows is among the least effective tools for behavioral transformation. Neuroscientist James Cone at the University of Virginia has conducted extensive research on what he calls social baseline theory. This is the principle that human nervous system evolved with the fundamental expectation of social connection. Connection is not a luxury the nervous system enjoys. It is a baseline requirement the nervous system needs to function well. We are all energetic beings, and energy connects to energy. Isolation, chronic disconnection, and the inability to authentically express emotional states are not emotionally neutral. They are neurological stressors with measurable psychological consequences. Men socialized to suppress vulnerability and maintain emotional armor are living in a state of chronic disconnection, even when surrounded by other people. And a chronically dysregulated nervous system will express that dysregulation outward in ways that cause harm until it is given the condition it was designed for: connection, safety, the permission to be fully human. Let's connect with the past, because here is what I find most remarkable and most humbling. This imbalance is not ancient, it is modern. Across cultures and across centuries, human traditions develop sophisticated understandings of masculine and feminine principles. And nearly universally, they understood that wholeness required both, that imbalance in either direction produced suffering, that the goal was not dominance of one over the other, but integration of both, thus meaning divine feminine and divine masculine. In Taoist philosophy, dating back to the 4th century BCE, notes that the concept of yin and yang describes not a battle between opposites, but a dynamic, interdependent, constantly moving balance. Yang is associated with the active, directive, expansion, masculine principle, and it is not superior to yin. It is incomplete without it. The Tao Te Ching consistently values the qualities of water over stone, softness over rigidity, yielding over forcing, depth over surface. The most revered Taoist ideal of the sage embodies both strength that does not need to dominate and action that does not need to control. In many indigenous traditions of the Americas, including numerous plains nations, Navajo, Lakota, Zuni, and others, understood the concept of two-spirit people. They honored individuals of two-spirit, who carried both masculine and feminine spiritual gifts. These were not marginalized identities in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Quite the opposite. In many traditions, two-spirit people held sacred roles as healers, as ceremonial leaders, as bridges between worlds. The culture's understanding of gender was sophisticated enough to recognize that the full spectrum of masculine and feminine energy existed within individuals, and that integrating both was a special gift, not an aberration. In African traditional cultures, including the Dagara people of West Africa, whose traditions were brought to broader Western awareness through the work of Malidoma Patrice Some, had rites of passage for young men that were profoundly holistic. They did not simply test physical endurance. They required the young man to die symbolically to his boyhood identity and be reborn into a masculine role that included community, responsibility, emotional wisdom, spiritual awareness, and service to the whole. Initiation was not about proving toughness, it was about becoming capable of authentic relationships. In ancient Celtic tradition and in many pagan and polytheistic European traditions, the divine masculine was understood as equally paired with the divine feminine, neither subordinate to the other. The male principle in Celtic mythology encompasses not just the warrior archetype, the bard, the healer, the keeper of wisdom. Figures like Dagda, who was the good god of Irish mythology, embodied strength, fertility, abundance, and musicianship simultaneously. The rigid separation of masculinity from tenderness, creativity, and emotional depth is not ancient. It is a relatively recent cultural construction. Ancient Greek philosophy, despite its well-documented patriarchal elements, also contained sophisticated thinking about the integration of qualities we now gender code. Plato's Symposium includes Aristophanes' myth of the origin of love, the idea that human beings were once whole, containing both masculine and feminine, and that the longing for love is the longing to return to that original wholeness. Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, human flourishing, required the cultivation of virtues that we now split across gender lines: courage and temperance, justice and wisdom, action and reflection. The message across these vastly different traditions is remarkably consistent. True masculine power was never about domination. It was always about integration, the capacity to be both strong and tender, both decisive and receptive, both a warrior and a healer. That understanding did not disappear because it was strong. It was suppressed because it was inconvenient for systems built on hierarchy and control. And we are living in the consequences of that suppression. So, if so many traditions understood this balance, if the wisdom was already there, what happened? Why are we here, in a moment when a viral question reveals that millions of women feel safer with a wild animal than with an unknown man? The roots are multiple and intersecting, so let's name them honestly. The collapse of male rites of passage. Across the cultures we just explored, boys became men through structured, community-held processes that guided them from boyhood identity into masculine roles that included emotional wisdom, relational responsibility, and spiritual depth. The Industrial Revolution dismantled those community structures. The nuclear family model isolated men from extended kinship networks that had provided mentorship, accountability, and belonging. The result is generations of men who were never guided through a genuine transition, who arrived at adult bodies without gaining adult emotional frameworks. Psychologist Robert Bly, in his groundbreaking 1990 work, Iron John, described this as a wound of the uninitiated man, the man who never received from older men the transmission of what masculine depth actually means, who was left to construct his identity from cultural scripts, sports heroes, sexual conquests, financial dominance, and emotional armor. The emotional suppression of boys, research by developmental psychologist Niobe Way at New York University, documented in her 2011 book, Deep Secrets: Boys' Friendships and the Crisis of Connection, found that young boys are naturally emotionally expressive and capable of very deep friendships. By adolescence, those capacities are systematically suppressed by peer culture and adult expectation. Boys learn to perform toughness, and the performance, repeated long enough, becomes the only self they know. Social isolation and the collapse of community. Robert Putnam's landmark research, documented in Bowling Alone in 2000, traced the dramatic decline of social capital in American life over the latter half of the 20th century. Men, particularly, have seen catastrophic declines in friendship depth and community belonging. A 2021 survey by the Survey Center on American Life found that 15% of American men reported having no close friendships, up from 3% in 1990. A man with no close friends has no safe container for vulnerability. His emotional life has nowhere to go except inward, where it festers, or outward, where it often causes harm. Digital culture, toxic podcast bros, and the radicalization of wounded masculinity has created spaces of communities, forums, entire ecosystems, where the wound of disconnected masculinity is not healed, but it's weaponized. Where the legitimate pain of isolation and identity confusion is redirected toward blame, misogyny, and increasingly extreme ideological frameworks. Research by the Institute of Strategic Dialogue and the Southern Poverty Law Center has documented how online radicalization pipelines, such as online gaming and podcasts, specifically target young men experiencing social isolation and identity crisis. This is not because those men are inherently dangerous, but because their wound makes them vulnerable to whoever offers them the most emotionally satisfying story about why they are suffering. Understanding this is not excusing it. It is essential for addressing it, because you cannot heal what you only condemn. Now let's look honestly at what the data shows about the consequences of this imbalance. Men die from suicide at approximately 4 times the rate of women in the United States. This is a pattern consistent across most industrialized nations, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization. The gap is widest in midlife among men aged 45 to 64. Men in this demographic are dying from their inability to ask for help, to acknowledge their suffering, and to reach toward connection at a rate that constitutes a genuine public health crisis. Research published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that men are significantly less likely than women to seek mental health treatment. They're less likely to disclose psychological distress to a physician, and more likely to present mental health crisis through behavioral channels such as substance abuse, aggression, and risk-taking, rather than through direct help-seeking. The masculine norm of self-sufficiency is not protecting men, it is killing them quietly. Intimate partner violence statistics, documented annually by the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, consistently show that approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men in the United States experience severe intimate partner physical violence. The majority of perpetrators of heterosexual partner violence are men. This is not because men are inherently violent. The research consistently shows that perpetration of intimate partner violence is strongly associated with emotional dysregulation, childhood trauma, social isolation, and insecure attachment, all of which are directly connected to the cultural suppression of emotional development in boys and men. And then there is the bare question itself. As a social phenomenon, it is data. When millions of women across different cultures, ages, and backgrounds independently arrive at the same answer, that they feel less safe with a stranger who happens to be male than with a wild animal, that is not a rational fear. That is cumulative experience expressing itself. It is the statistical reality of risk as women have lived it encoded into a cultural moment. That really deserves to be heard without defensiveness. And the men who are doing the inner work, who are choosing differently, who are living with genuine integrity and emotional depth, they are not served by that defensiveness either. They are served by the culture changing around them. This is not about hating men. It is about honestly naming what fear of men has cost and what healing could return. This is the section I have been building toward, because this is the most important part of the conversation. And it is the part that the loudest voices on both sides of this cultural debate most consistently skip. Healing is possible. The research is clear on this, and the wisdom traditions have been pointing toward the same path for thousands of years. So let's name it concretely. For men, the work of reconnection. Research by Brené Brown at the University of Houston, whose work on vulnerability and shame has become among the most widely cited in contemporary social psychology, demonstrates consistently that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the birthplace of connection, creativity, and courage. Her research, documented in Daring Greatly in 2012, and subsequent work, shows that men experience shame most acutely around the fear of being perceived as weak, and that this shame is the primary barrier to the authentic connection that their nervous systems are literally designed for. The antidote to shame is not more armor. It is witnessed vulnerability. It is the experience of being seen in one's full humanity, including fear, uncertainty, and need, and not being destroyed by that exposure. This is what healthy male relationships, healthy therapeutic relationships, and healthy intimate partnerships make possible. Research on men in therapy, including work by psychologist William Pollack at Harvard Medical School, has shown that men who engage in therapeutic relationships that honor masculine communication styles and do not pathologize masculine expression show significant improvements in emotional intelligence, relationship quality, and mental health outcomes. The therapy room that meets men where they are rather than asking them to become someone else is dramatically more effective than one that does not. Somatic work, body-based trauma healing approaches, including the work of Peter Levine's Somatic Experiencing and Bessel van der Kolk's research documented in The Body Keeps the Score in 2014, has shown particular efficacy for healing the kind of developmental and relational trauma that underlies much of what we call toxic masculine behavior, because the wound lives in the body, not just in the mind, and the healing must too. For boys, the work of experiencing emotional literacy. Research by the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence, led by Mark Brackett, author of Permission to Feel in 2019, has documented that emotional literacy education in schools produces measurable improvements in academic performance, social behavior, mental health, and long-term relationship quality. Teaching boys that emotions are data, not weakness, not performance, but information their nervous systems generate to help them navigate life, is among the highest yield intervention available for changing the trajectory of masculine development. Now, for communities, the restoration of initiation and belonging. Anthropologist David Gilmour's cross-cultural analysis in Manhood in the Making in 1990 found that virtually every human culture that has maintained psychological health and social cohesion across generations has had some form of structured masculine initiation. This is a held, community-supported process for guiding boys into men who understand their role as protectors, contributors, and relational beings. The modern West has largely abandoned this. The organizations that have rushed to fill the vacuum, such as fraternities, gangs, online communities, often encode the wound rather than healing it. Contemporary organizations, including the Mankind Project, which runs initiation-based men's weekends informed by depth psychology and cross-cultural wisdom, have documented significant positive effects on participants' emotional intelligence, relationship quality, and sense of purposeful masculine identity. The need for initiation is not obsolete. The structures that once delivered it are. Now, for all of us, the cultivation of what the traditions called integration. The goal is not for men to become more feminine or women to become more masculine in any superficial or performative sense. The goal, which psychology, Taoist philosophy, indigenous traditions, and contemporary neuroscience all converge on, is for every human being to have access to the full spectrum of their humanity, to be both strong and tender, both structured and fluid, both capable of fierce protection and genuine vulnerability. Because a man who can cry is not less of a man. He's more of a human being, which we all are. And a world full of men who are fully human is a world where the bare question no longer makes sense. Let's bring this to its deepest level, because I think the cultural conversation about toxic masculinity, as important as it is, often stays at the surface level, just addressing behavior without touching the root. And the root, as the wisdom traditions have always known, is spiritual. What we call the divine masculine and the divine feminine are not gender identities directly connected to men and women. They are principles, archetypal forces that exist within every single human psyche, and the great wisdom traditions of the world have consistently been understood as needing to be in balance. The divine masculine, in its healthy, integrated expression, is protective without being controlling, decisive without being rigid, disciplined without being punishing. It acts from clarity and love, not from fear and a need for dominance. It holds structure so that life within it can flourish. It initiates from integrity. The divine feminine, in its healthy, integrated expression, is deeply intuitive and deeply discerning. It creates, receives, and holds. It nurtures from abundance rather than depletion. It speaks truth with compassion rather than swallowing truth with resentment. It connects without losing itself. Toxic masculinity is what happens when the masculine principle loses its feminine counterbalance, when strength becomes domination because empathy is completely absent, when decisiveness becomes rigidity because wisdom is absent, when protection becomes control because trust is absent, and the healing, on the individual level and on the collective level, is slow, genuine, often painful work of being those principles back into relationship with each other, within each person, within each relationship, within each community. Carl Jung called this individuation. It is the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating the parts of the self that have been split off, suppressed, or projected outward. He spent a lifetime documenting what happens when that integration is refused, in individuals and in cultures. The shadow grows. The wound festers. And what cannot be integrated internally gets expressed outward in relationships, in institutions, in the collective choices a society makes. We are living in a shadow moment, collectively. The imbalance that has been building for centuries is surfacing. In viral questions about bears, in political polarization, in the epidemic of male loneliness and suicide, in the Me Too reckoning, in the crisis of identity that young men are navigating right now with almost no cultural guidance, other than the toxic masculine celebrities, politicians, podcasters, gamers, and online predators. The shadow surfacing is not the problem. The shadow surfacing is the opportunity. Because what has been made conscious can be worked with. What has been named can begin to be healed. And what begins to heal in individuals ripples outward into families, into communities, and into our culture. You don't heal toxic masculinity by attacking men. You heal it by helping men reconnect to their full humanity. And you build a world where that reconnection is not only possible, but it's honored. This episode of Beyond Horizyns is brought to you by Tea for Peace Tranquility Lounge, and I want to take this sponsor moment in a slightly different direction today because it feels true to this specific conversation. One of the oldest cross-cultural expressions of the integration we have been talking about today is the tea ceremony. Not tea as a beverage, but tea as a practice. In Japanese Chado, the way of tea, the ceremony is specifically designed to create a space of equality, stillness, and genuine presence. The tea room is a space where social hierarchies are suspended, where every person bows to enter through the same small door, no matter if you are male, female, rich or poor, where the act of making and receiving tea is an act of mutual vulnerability and care. The quick tip for today is this. Consider building a daily tea ritual specifically as a practice of slowing down, of sitting with yourself and your emotions, of creating even 5 or 10 minutes of genuine internal stillness, the kind of stillness that allows you to feel what is actually present rather than what the performance of your day requires you to project. Research on contemplative practices, including a 2014 study published in Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience, has shown that even brief, consistent mindfulness practice measurably increase activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with self-awareness, empathy, and emotional regulation. The very capacities that the culture has been systematically suppressing in men. The very capacities that reconnection to the full self requires. Tea for Peace Tranquility Lounge is built on the understanding that the simplest rituals practiced with intention can be profound acts of self-restoration, and right now, for all of us, restoration is exactly what is needed. Find Tea for Peace through the link in the show notes, and make yourself a cup, slowly, with full presence. Now, let's get everyone connecting and communicating. We began this special edition episode with a question about a bear, and we followed that question all the way down through the psychology of wounded masculinity, through the neuroscience of stress and disconnection, through 60,000 years of human wisdom about balance and integration, through the documented consequences of what happens when that balance is lost, and through the genuine research-supported, tradition-honored path toward healing. What we found is this. Toxic masculinity is real. Its effects are documented and severe in the bodies and psyches of men themselves, and in the lives of the people who love them and the people who fear them. The American Psychological Association's research is clear. The CDC statistics are clear. The neuroscience of chronic stress and emotional suppression is clear. And the wisdom traditions are equally clear. That this imbalance is not inevitable, that it is not the natural expression of masculine energy, but its distortion. That across the Taoist, indigenous, African, Celtic, and countless other traditions, masculine power at its fullest has always included tenderness, wisdom, relational depth, and the capacity for genuine vulnerability. The path forward is integration, not the performance of integration, not the vocabulary of integration without the substance, the actual, embodied, often very uncomfortable, but always worthwhile work of becoming whole. For men, finding the courage to feel what is there, to reach toward connection rather than performing invulnerability, to do the inner work, whether through therapy, somatic practice, men's community, or the simple act of allowing yourself to be honestly known by one other human being. For all of us, holding the complexity, seeing the wound beneath the behavior without excusing the behavior, refusing the false choice between condemning men and excusing harm, building the kind of culture in our families, our communities, our conversations, where boys are taught that their full emotional range is a strength, not a liability. This includes the vulnerable emotions as well as the empowering ones. And what if we really got there? What if a generation from now, a critical mass of men actually had done this work? What if the culture had shifted enough that emotional literacy in boys was as valued as athletic performance? What if masculine initiation, the genuine, community-held, psychologically sophisticated kind, was accessible and normalized? What if the goal was not to choose between the bear and the man, but to build a world where that question no longer needed to exist? This is not utopia. This is a direction. And every person who does this work, every man who chooses integration over armor, every community that creates space for masculine healing, every conversation that holds complexity instead of collapsing into blame, moves the world one small, irreversible step in that direction. That is enough. That is everything. If this episode moved you, if it gave you something to think about, something to feel, something to share with someone who needs it, please follow the Beyond Horizyns podcast wherever you are listening right now, so you don't miss future conversations. And I want to invite you into our growing Horizyns community at www.horizyns.inc.com. That is HORIZYNSINC.com, where you can meet like-minded individuals, find amazing products, and take workshops from our curated vendors. Each week, We will keep exploring new ideas, traditions, and perspectives that can help us live more balanced, more meaningful, more integrated lives. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having the courage to sit with a hard conversation all the way to the end. It means more than you know. And until next time, keep exploring what lies beyond the horizon.
We're going beyond horizons, where the mind is